Hello and welcome to tonight's online public lecture, Sustainability in a Cost of Living Crisis. My name is Emma and I'll be your host for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Spiraling inflation and the cost of living crisis has seen businesses and consumers alike cut back on sustainable practices and products and instead opt for cheaper, less sustainable alternatives. Tonight we'll be exploring whether we can balance economic prosperity against the need to protect our planet. Here's what we've got coming up this evening. We have two speakers this evening, Professor Rick Stafford and Dr. Mili Shrivastava, who'll each be sharing a presentation of around 25 minutes. We'll then have some time with both Mili and Rick for questions and answers before closing the event at around 8:30 p.m. We're using a platform called Crowdcast for tonight's event. If you haven't used this platform before, there's just a few things to be aware of. Firstly, we're not going to be able to see or hear you. Only our speakers will have their cameras and their microphones turned on. That means that the best way to interact with them and with each other is through the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen and the Ask a Question box. Please use the chat box to share any thoughts, feedback, observations, or comments that you have throughout the event. You can use the question box to pose any questions that you have for Rick and Mili to discuss in the section at the end. And you can also use this to vote on each other's questions as well. So if you spot a question in there that you'd particularly like to know the answer to, make sure you click on the arrow to the right-hand side of that question to upvote it, and we'll address the more popular questions in our discussion at the end. Our speakers may also have some questions for you, so they'll be using polls to get your thoughts and feedback as well. This is the bar chart type icon on the right-hand side of your screen, and we're just going to do a quick practice now to show you how this will look. Each of our polls will be multiple choice questions and are completely anonymous, so please don't be afraid to get involved and share your perspective. If you click on the bar chart to the right-hand side now, you'll see we've asked the question, have you joined an event from Bournemouth University before? So please do let us know if this is your first event, if you've been with us a few times before, or if you're a regular attendee at our Bournemouth University event, and we'll see what the results say. I've not actually got anything coming up on my screen. There we go. So we've had a few votes through. It looks like the majority of you are here for the first time. So a big welcome to all of you joining us for the first time. If you've been here before, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed tonight's event. So without further ado, we'll hand over now to our first speaker for this evening, Professor Rick Stafford, who's going to be talking to us about building a sustainable society. Hi, Rick, over to you.
Hi there, thanks very much. Just going to get my slides up now. Thanks for the introduction, Emma, and it's great to be here, and it's great to be talking to so many people here today. It kind of reminds me a little bit that I did a talk which was a little bit similar to this, which was in early 2020, and obviously lots of things have changed since 2020, particularly early 2020. So the talk, I think, was in February. We've had a whole sort of 2 years of a COVID pandemic. We're beginning to come out of that COVID pandemic now, and we're probably moving into a new financial crisis and a cost of living crisis. So potentially, obviously, there's more. Perhaps in 2020, we were really at the sort of height of being aware of what was going on environmentally and really trying to address some of those challenges. And maybe that emphasis has changed a little bit. And we know the environment is still vitally important. But one thing I would like to try and find out, and this is going to be your essentially the first sort of question that I want to ask you. If I can see my slides. Let me try and show those again. Bear with me a second. Here we go. Great. So the question I want to ask you, and you can go to the poll button, is what do you think is the biggest threat to the environment that needs addressing right now? And I want you to think on a global scale, really. So go over to the poll, start clicking on the answers that you, the single thing really that you think is the most important environmental factor at the moment. If you think there's something else which isn't in the list, there is a reason I've got that list, and I'll explain it to you in a second. But if there's for something else, then please do put it into the chat as well. I'd be happy to hear other opinions. So yeah, have a look at the poll, click on some of the buttons, and yeah, let me know what you think is the biggest environmental threat at the moment. Okay, so the reason I'm asking this question is just before COVID, so late 2019, early 2020, a student of mine, Ellie Jones, actually did this as a survey, and she asked about 120 people what they thought. So the results that we're getting coming up at the moment, 2/3 of you are saying climate change is the biggest environmental threat. The other options, nobody's voted for deforestation, got 4 votes for biodiversity loss, nothing for overpopulation, 1 for pollution, and nothing for ocean plastic. And that sort of probably 2/3 of people voting for climate change is very similar to the results which we got. And although the paper was published in 2021, the survey was done in about 2019, late 2019. So again, we can see that people were thinking climate change was the most important threat. I'm going to explain probably what the most important threats to the environment are in a second. But what's quite nice is that this at least hasn't changed. And while people's perception of what's maybe the biggest issues in society might have changed since 2019, at least in terms of the environmental threats, we're probably still pretty much on the same wavelength as we were then. And obviously, during COVID, we talked about a green recovery from COVID. And the idea would be we'd be able to put plenty of investment in place. We'd come back to we'd come out of COVID to a situation where we had a load of renewable energy, we had loads of, a really sort of strong economy, and we were reducing climate change at the same time. And really, that hasn't happened. But right now as well, we still need solutions to address these environmental issues, and we need to ensure we've got a healthy and happy society as well. And that's really the idea behind Kate Raworth's idea around donut economics. So this green circle, which you can see, which looks a little bit like a ring donut, essentially, which is where it's got the name from. We should be having a economic and political situation where basically everything which we do in the whole of society exists within that green donut. And you can probably see on there's something called the environmental ceiling. So if we do too much harm to the environment in any particular way, we'll burst through that environmental ceiling. And that's something that the planet can't really cope with. So to give you an example, if we keep putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then what we'll see is we'll eventually create anthropogenic climate change, as we have. We'll basically have climate change bursting through that environmental ceiling. Okay, we can put a tiny bit of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but when we're putting as much as we are now, we go through that environmental ceiling, and we create a situation which the planet can't really cope with. But also inside the donut, you can see there's something called the social foundation or the social floor. And it's possible to fall through that social floor as well. And that's less about environmental concerns and more about sort of the society's concerns. So it can be things like healthcare, it could be access to food or water. It can even be sort of having a political voice or something like that. And those things need to be in place socially. So we're within that green space of the donut, but we don't overshoot the boundaries of that donut. And if we look at where we are from a global perspective, so this is a figure from the Donut Economics website, we can see we're really not doing very well. We're overshooting our environmental or ecological ceiling in multiple ways. Okay, so the biggest threats which we have are these things which are really exceeding these ecological ceilings, or in some other terminology, exceeding our planetary boundaries which we have. So they are climate change, which is obviously the thing that everybody voted, or 2/3 of you voted for as being the most important factor. We've got nitrogen and phosphorus loading. So basically the amount of fertilizers and things that we put onto agriculture, which can wash into rivers, wash into coastal areas and cause huge problems. And we've got biodiversity loss. And biodiversity loss is twofold here. We're directly losing biodiversity, but we're also converting a lot of land, which would have been nature, which would have been land for nature. So we're losing biodiversity on two counts. So really the biggest environmental threats which we face are these three things: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution as well. But we're also not doing very well globally in terms of ensuring we've got a healthy and thriving society. And we see all sorts of things in there, like unequal access or not enough access to energy or water or healthcare. And certainly, things like gender equality across the globe are also falling short of where we should be in terms of society. If that's a global scale, then where are we at a UK scale? And while this looks a little bit different, it basically shows the same message. We're still not doing very well at a UK scale either. And we're still exceeding our environmental ceiling in terms of pollution, including things like air quality in this case as well, land use change, biodiversity loss, climate change. So essentially the same factors in the UK as we see globally. But we're also not meeting our social needs as well. And it's particularly factors like income, and that's particularly the low levels of income in the UK, education, housing, and mental and physical health, which are all below the societal or the social floor in this case. And this was a study from Oxfam done in 2015. But clearly, in the current situation which we're in, these things are going to fall even more with sort of, with less money and with cuts to public services, these things are going to be even more affected. So the question is, how do we address the environmental crisis, but also ensure societal needs are met? And I'm going to address that, and it's mainly going to be a kind of a UK focus, although there are lessons which will apply pretty much anywhere around the world. And I know we've got people from all around the world in the audience tonight. So what I'm going to do is begin to create a model to look at policy interventions. And while you can see a whole different range of things here, which go from kind of various jobs to things like ways that you can travel, right through to things like biodiversity, environmental breakdown, I'm really going to look at three measures of what these policy interventions could address. And there's reasons for that. The first one is going to be environmental breakdown. And that was a term which was coined by the Institute for Public Policy Research in the UK, probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's considered kind of an interaction of everything. It's interaction of climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, other environmental problems as well. So it's essentially the best sort of single measure we can have of whether we're exceeding that environmental ceiling in that donut economics model. I'm also going to look at socioeconomic inequality, which is kind of the best single measure I can get of the inner circle, the meeting the societal needs within that donut model as well. And in terms of inequality, well, the UK itself has plenty of money at the moment. I've actually seen a study the other day that there is a current shortage of Moet champagne in the UK. And that's because too many people are going out and buying Moet champagne. And yet other people are having to rely on food banks. We're an incredibly unequal society. We're actually the second most unequal society in the G7 after the US. And we are tying kind of with Bulgaria at the moment, I think, but to be the least equal country in the in Europe. It's not a position that we should be trying to be in by any means. So environmental breakdown, socioeconomic inequality, which relate to that donut model, but also I'm going to look at economic growth. And economic growth, I'm particularly looking at that because it's been mentioned so much. And really, it was kind of Liz Truss's mantra in the short time which she was Prime Minister. We have to grow the economy. talking to everybody else as an anti-growth coalition. But actually, even if you listen to any of the mainstream political parties at the moment, they're suggesting we have to grow the economy in order to get out of the cost of living crisis. So I want to examine economic growth and what that really means, and what that means for environment and for inequality as well. So we created a model. You can see how all these different nodes or circles or factors in the model are interconnected. It's a very complicated model. I'm not going to try and explain it all to you. But this was from a paper which we produced, which was really looking at green recovery plans from COVID. And I think it's particularly applicable now as well. We could still introduce these plans and still make a real difference to the environment and to society. And it's based around the idea of government investment in certain industries and certain jobs, and particularly those jobs, the lower figures really showing the interactions with jobs, which relate to the Green New Deal strategies. And if you don't know about the Green New Deal strategies, I'm going to go through a series of scenarios and I'll explain what some of them are as we do that. So I do appreciate this is a little bit small and maybe a little bit hard to see, particularly if you're watching this on a laptop or a tablet or something like that. But to explain these results, and it's also worth saying that if you've got any questions about these results, James, who was the lead author of this paper, I believe is in the audience and able to answer the Q&A chat. So if you do have any questions, he may be able to answer some of those. And equally, some of those questions might come to me as well later on. So please do ask questions if things aren't clear. We've got 8 different scenarios here, 8 different potential policy interventions which we could look at and to see what the overall sort of effects on environmental breakdown, socioeconomic inequality and economic growth could be. The bars in the charts represent a ranking. So the higher they are, the better they are scoring out of those different 8 scenarios. So they all go from 1 to 8. The first 3 bars I won't talk about too much, but they are climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. And the higher the bar, the better the environmental outcome. So the more we'll do to address climate change, the less biodiversity we'll lose and the less pollution will go into the environment. The third 3 bars on any of the charts relate to, firstly, environmental breakdown. Again, higher means better outcomes for the environment. Socioeconomic inequality. And again, higher socioeconomic inequality on this bar is actually a good thing. It reduces that socioeconomic inequality. And economic growth. And the higher the bar, the more economic growth there is. So if we look at the first figure in the top left, basically a strategy about increasing renewable energy and focusing on jobs in that renewable energy sector. And what we see is there's moderate outcomes for the environment, but quite good outcomes for reducing inequality and economic growth. And I'm going to go through a few different scenarios and I'm going to try and explain why they've occurred at the end. So if we move along to the second on the top column, second from the left on the top column, in this case, we're looking at extra green jobs. We're looking at what I call the core Green New Deal strategy. Okay, so that does include renewables, as in the first figure, but also things like public transport, things like retrofitting of houses and retrofitting of workplaces, and investment in jobs in those industries as well. And what we see if we do that, we actually further decrease socioeconomic inequality, we further increase economic growth, but slightly counterintuitively, because we've actually put a lot more kind of green things in place by doing this, we've actually got worse outcomes than before for the environment. And I'll try and explain why at the end. And it's only when we start introducing green taxation and removing fossil fuel subsidies, which is basically the money that the government, lots of governments give to fossil fuel companies every single year, billions of pounds. But once we remove those and increase green taxation, we begin to see environmental benefits again. We get good environmental benefits from those sorts of strategies. Although, unfortunately, the inequality level also begins to fall. We become a more unequal society than we would have done without those taxation, which is possibly because things like fuel, so either petrol or heating costs or something like that could be more heavily taxed, and that's going to have an effect on people. It also massively reduces economic growth. Probably the best overall compromise strategy, because there's always a compromise, but benefiting the environment and social inequality the most, so kind of really getting to the middle of that donut model, is the second one in on the bottom row. And in this case, this is probably the optimal result. It involves lots of investment in green jobs, the whole core Green New Deal. But as an ecologist, I'm also delighted to say it's also investing in conservation, jobs in conservation and in nature-based solutions. It can also include other low carbon jobs as well. So things like social care and nursing and teaching all will have benefits in reducing inequality and basically enhancing society. And that's coupled with those strong environmental finances, so carbon taxation and ending fossil fuel subsidies. That probably gives us the best overall outcome. But in actual fact, the overall outcome in terms of economic growth is actually very modest. It isn't one of the high economic growth strategies, but it's probably the best for addressing jointly the environment and socioeconomic inequity. We move along to the next graph, so the third on the bottom row. This is just about increasing manufacturing, traditional manufacturing, without that green focus. And if we do that, we don't see the environmental benefits compared to if we really focus on some of the environmental side of things that we need to produce. And then the final graph in the bottom right is essentially a growth strategy. And what you can see, this idea that if we just boost economic growth, the idea that that wealth will trickle down doesn't show up in our model at all. And we actually have the lowest incomes there for socioeconomic inequality. So there seems to be two things going on here. And there is certainly a tension between economic growth and the benefits that come out to the environment. And that seems to be really because as we increase economic growth, we can see it in the model, we are using more and more natural resources, and that those more and more natural resources could be increasing carbon emissions, they could be using up land for biodiversity, they could be creating pollution, so they have a negative effect on the environment. So that's a major issue. So how do we really how do we benefit society? It seems what we really need to be doing is investment in these core Green New Deal jobs. And that provides benefits for other industries too. So that's one of the reasons that inequality starts to improve as we invest more and more in these green jobs. So while you can't see it here, if you look at the full results of the model, then we can see things like if you're creating renewable energy, if you're creating insulation for retrofitting and so on, then what you'll see is while you're increasing that, you also need manufacturing to support those industries. So we're creating more jobs within manufacturing, we're creating more jobs in transportation and logistics and things like that. So we need to be able to do that, and that will benefit people in society and create a more equal society. But we also need to limit growth in other areas. In any area where there's high pollution, we need to limit that growth and probably reduce that growth and actually have shrinkage in those areas through targeted measures like heavy carbon taxation on those businesses. But all businesses need to be as green as possible. We need to reduce carbon emissions, we need to reduce resource use, we need to reduce pollution coming out of homes, but particularly out of businesses if we're going to create a viable economy which also limits carbon emissions. So we need to reduce pollution in the most polluting industries, we need to reduce the size of those most polluting industries, but then create the cleanest possible growth in those businesses which we really want to support. And if we can do that, we can get our way out of out of the worst of these cost of living crisis, and we can make real changes and real benefits to the environment. And I'm going to leave that there because I think that will tail very nicely into Mili's talk coming later on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rick. That was really interesting. And obviously this event comes hot off the heels of the COP27 climate change conference, where the world's leaders and great and good gather together to come up with some of these policies and interventions and reach that consensus on what might work. So what would you like to see come out of this year's event? Or do you think it's a case of kind of all talk, no action?
There's been a lot of talk and very, very little action, I guess, across multiple COPs for a long time. I guess, within the context of this talk, what we have seen happen, which hasn't happened before, is there has been an agreement for essentially paying for damage. So we've, at a global level and based around climate change, we're probably beginning to address that social side of that donut model and beginning to actually be able to provide some benefits to developing countries to really sort of cope with those changes from climate change and help society. But what's really failed is anything to do with emission cuts as well. It is also worth saying, while that was COP27, there's also COP15, which is happening in a few weeks. And it's not 12 years behind. It's actually the biodiversity COP. It's happening in Canada. So there may well be some useful environmental outcomes coming out of that as well. But we'll have to see. I'm not entirely sure how effective the current climate COP has been.
Okay, thank you, Rick. And Rick will be joining us again for the question and answer session at the end of the event. So please do keep your questions coming using the Ask a Question box, and also vote on each other's questions if there's any you'd particularly like Rick to answer. I'm going to hand over now to our second speaker this evening, Dr. Mili Shrivastava, who is from Bournemouth University's Centre for Sustainable Business Transformations and will be talking to us about sustainable business. Over to you, Mili.
Thank you so very much, Emma. I'm delighted to be here and talk about sustainable business. Rick has laid a very strong foundation and discussion for if we can achieve economic growth and sustainable society together, and can they co-develop together. And I hope that with my talk on sustainable business, we bring that into the picture and see how sustainable business and sustainable society are intertwined and how they need to move together for a sustainable future. Let me just share my slides. So hello everyone again. As Emma mentioned, I co-lead on the Center for Sustainable Business Transformations, which is actually towards the work for enabling sustainable businesses. And we'll be happy to talk about it towards the end if anybody has any questions. So what is a sustainable business? Sustainable business is an enterprise that is in harmony with people and planet. So basically, a sustainable business creates long-term value while taking into consideration that it plays in the ecological, social, and economic environment. But why do we expect businesses to be sustainable? I mean, aren't they are they supposed to be creating jobs, supposed to be creating products and services? So why there is, an expectation even for businesses to be sustainable? Now, the reason is, as also Rick touched upon in his talk, that there are significant impacts from the businesses on the ecological side, but also impacts on society. So through their various business actions, business decisions, products and services, there is an impact in the term of carbon, but also ecological footprint by use of natural resources for the value creation activities. And the impact on society, the businesses are in a way consumers of human capital, and through their products and services are reaching out to society to be, as a market. But through their different actions and decisions, practices, processes, structures, techniques, they leave an impact on society. So they are interrelated, and there is, as was also highlighted in Rick's talk, that there is a vast impact on society from business actions. Now, if we look at various theories in economics, there traditionally through capitalism, a lot of philosophers have come up about why businesses should be, what businesses' responsibilities are, to whom they are responsible to. And then there are two very separate line of thoughts about stakeholders versus shareholders. So a stakeholders line of thought, it suggests that business leaders, they must understand and account for all of their company stakeholders, the constituents that impact their operations and are impacted by its operations. And stakeholders will include employees, consumers, suppliers, governments, and society at large. So the company, the businesses are responsible and accountable to all its stakeholders. While there is a contradictory line of thought, we suggest that managers, they are primarily have a duty to maximize shareholder returns, and it is a duty of the business and managers to balance the shareholders' financial interest against the interest of other stakeholders, such as employees. So you see that there is already a kind of tussle between what the businesses should be doing, what are their responsibilities, and whom they are accountable to. But is there a way that the win-win situation for both stakeholders and shareholders? And that's where it leads us to think about the infusion of sustainability as well, because sustainability is about that there will be enough for everyone forever, and the businesses, through their different actions, decisions, operations, use of natural resources, they are kind of having a significant impact on its stakeholders, on its consumers, on its employees. So is there a business case for businesses to be sustainable? And can they actually do well by doing good? So there is a vast amount of research which talks about, can there be a business case for businesses, and can they actually do well by doing good? And as these opposing theories of economics, as I mentioned, shareholder theories, stakeholder theory, and of course, Adam Smith and a whole lot of scholars who have thought about capitalism and whether it works for society or against society, well, to kind of provide evidence for whether businesses should actually be considered as entities which can should play for society and not against it. There started emerging a lot of research, a lot of evidence which started building a business case for businesses to do good and to do well by doing good. So sustainability is not something which is eating up on businesses' financial performance, and it's the interest of the shareholders, but actually it is supporting what it aims to achieve for the interest of the shareholders by actually incorporating the interest of the stakeholders. So in that line of research, a lot of positive, lot of studies have found that there is a positive impact on firm performance when companies do good. So for example, in that line of research, my own research has looked upon whether companies, when businesses can do good by being good. And we find out that, well, it might depend on the type of business. So for example, an entrepreneurial startup which is just starting, might go for a particular type of sustainability activity or sustainability strategy, as opposed to a large business which might go for other type of sustainable activity or process or new product. But we find, using a large data set on European firms, that actually businesses have positive impact on their firm performance if they employ sustainable activities. So here you see that we went a bit further to kind of dissect what it means for sustainable strategies. There could be the reason behind, the lack of clarity between whether there is a positive relationship between economic growth and sustainability activities, because, we kind of sometimes put everything in one pot and try to see the effect of that on the business performance. So here we kind of dissected the activities into different categories. So we say that, well, if a business is coming up with a green product or service, it is something which is tangible, which is external, which is going in the market, customers can see and feel it. While there could be something like an internal tangible activity, like investing in an equipment and hiring employees for greening, like Rick mentioned, for creating green jobs. There could be companies who are going actually beyond compliance, what actually regulators are asking them, and infusing all these activities in their production, which are internal, which are intangible, which don't go beyond the company. So because it is not something which is easily available and known to external stakeholders unless company communicates it. So whichever activity they do, falling into all these categories of external tangible or internal tangible or tangible internal, we found that it has a positive impact on firm performance. And this is just one study. Like I said, there has been a vast research since then, which has laid out a business case for sustainability. So while we acknowledge that, as Rick mentioned, that, there needs to be a further focused and coordinated and thought through approach as to where exactly interventions are needed. But the point is that we are way past where we should even think about, if we need a sustainable business, because that is so central to creating a sustainable society. And there is already a vast evidence which suggests that the sustainable practices is good. They have a positive impact on business performance. Now, this is where we looked at the environmental impact. But by sustainability and by sustainable business, society is an integral part of a sustainable business. If a company does phenomenal sustainable activities in terms of its positive environmental impact, but does not do good to the society, does not do good to its employees, does not do good to suppliers, that's not a sustainable business. So I also look at the social impact of business and consider as a part of being sustainable. And in this line of research, for example, we looked at how companies, if they are infusing diverse and inclusive practices in their procurement, are actually benefiting out of when they try to create the social value from their procurement. So this is a project which is ongoing on global value chains, where we look at large buyers who are trying to procure from their suppliers all over the globe. And we find out that they by thinking about if they can have diverse and inclusive supply chains, actually bring unique ideas in the form of products and services on the table. So in a way, it actually helps them to come up with views and which they never had before, or trying to think out of the box and giving opportunities to bottom-up pyramid entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, and so on. So we found out that the businesses who try to bring diversity and inclusivity in the supply chain benefit from the unique ideas, unique products and services. And actually, a lot of these suppliers who are bottom-up pyramid entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, they also, they found it to be very professional and much more ethical, as to what they're supposed to be, as a form of new startup entrepreneur. So in a way, it was a win-win situation for the business, for thinking about how to create more social value in their procurements, and a win-win situation for bottom-up pyramid entrepreneurs who are trying to get into the supply chain of large buyers. But sometimes capacity building, might be a challenge. So the bottom pyramid entrepreneurs might not be procure ready. So as we have seen, a couple of large companies through their initiatives, they are also trying to do capacity building programs and net mentoring, which kind of make the suppliers, women entrepreneurs, bottom pyramid entrepreneurs, procure ready, so that they are able to supply to large buyers. So it is a nice example of creating social value and working both ways for the suppliers as well as for large businesses. And when we actually found out that how it has turned out to be a business case for infusing diversity and inclusivity, so not out of any sort of just doing some sort of CSR or stitching somewhere in some part of supply chain that we are being inclusive and diverse. The large buyers are hugely benefiting from giving opportunities to diverse suppliers. So that's one example of how, for example, being to be creating social value, to be playing for society, and being and through their practices being something which creates a positive social impact. There is a business case for business because it has positive impact on their performance. So there, as I mentioned, there is vast research which has come by, and it's previously, while sustainability or something with respect to greening or green products or services was considered a niche, but actually it is now slowly becoming a norm in different sectors. So while previously a business will create a green product or service, and they have a common notion that it will cater to a particular niche market, now because consumers are becoming more and more conscious, and I'm not just a young generation or people who are potentially pay a price premium for a green product, but overall because of the things as Rick mentioned, sometimes because of some external crisis and trigger as well, that inclination of using a product or service that is sustainable, that leaves a positive impact, is also picks up. So the innovative, the company, the business which creates a sustainable product or service, is in the situation to explore the opportunities with innovative markets that have been shaping up. And overall, there is again a lot of research, and some of my research also, we study that a company which employs sustainable practices has another also does well on another aspect of firm performance, and that is employee turnover. So they do well in terms of staff retention, because employees, they overall feel much more satisfied and rewarded if they are working with an employer that puts people and planet at the center of what they do. And you might have seen, but it is now a lot of new research that has come into picture. It's not just a young generation which is thinking about if their employers are more environmental friendly, or if they create positive social impact, they feel much more motivated to give it to their employers. But it is across the spectrum that people feel more motivated to work with an employer who are creating positive social and environmental impact. And on the other hand, it can increase efficiency for businesses in terms of operation efficiency, in terms of energy efficiency. And while in the beginning it might look like a cost-taking exercise, there is a lot of research and evidence which suggests that in the long term, businesses that invest in sustainable practices, it impacts on their performance. And lastly, it creates reputation effects for businesses, so they look more engaged with all types of their stakeholders, and not just their shareholders, as to to drive economic profits, but also look more in consideration for their external stakeholders, their consumers, their employees, reciprocating to their suppliers when they try to do well by doing good. So there is a vast amount of evidence that has emerged in what we have seen over the last couple of years, that sustainability. I mean, it is way past the deadline when we could think of sustainability as just a niche or something which is, if a business can do some sort of CSR activity, giving some percentage of their profits as for some philanthropic activity. Now it should be something which should be embedded from top to bottom and bottom to top in business, and what it aspires to be, what it creates, how it operates, which type of social impact it leads on. So it should be something which is embedded in its very core for future proofing. As at the center we work with businesses, we find that that's the question which they try to answer for themselves. Do we like for example, like an MOT which you need to have to be able to run car on the road? Where do we stand next 20 years down the line? Where do we stand next 20 years down the line? So it enables that long-term thinking rather than the short-termism, and thinking about the short-term solutions which potentially can make business viable in the short term. However, with all sorts of challenges which we are seeing with respect to climate change and social inequalities, all sorts of stakeholders, are kind of expecting businesses to be future-proofing themselves and to be able to be viable in the future. So I hope that it gives a kind of a backdrop of why businesses should be sustainable. But is there something which you think is the starting point for a sustainable business? It will be nice if you can share your thoughts in the chat as to what you think is the starting point for sustainability in a business. Anyone? At the moment I can't see anything come by. Is there anything which you think ignites sustainability, the business to make the transformation towards being sustainable? Flowing down from customers, that's a very good point. Absolutely. So customers, I mean, the key stakeholder with the value proposition which a business aspires to create, and consumer behavior, as we have seen from COVID, that it has taken a big change. How it has changed kind of overnight. The change in consumer behavior have been profound in terms of looking for accountability, traceability. So yes, that's a very good point. Well, yes, to internalize externalities and negative environmental impact. Yes, sustainable and ethical materials and process, all very good answers. Absolutely. Employees, yes, absolutely. Employees and consumers and the external environment, they are actually, the critical drivers for, if we say that, if whether it is the ethical side of the business which kind of drives it to be a sustainable business, or is the external environment that is pushing it to be sustainable. And all these questions, all these answers actually are spot on, as employees, consumers, and the environmental impact in which the environment in which business operates is kind of they are key drivers in determining the sustainable actions of a business. Well, incentives for government, absolutely, they can also work as they can also trigger businesses to engage with the greening and sustainability. Absolutely. You all have given a very relevant answer and very something which is, which all play a role in determining the transformation of a business towards sustainability. Well, the first and foremost thing, if we look at a business, if we look at the business model, if you know that business model is something which conveys how the story of an enterprise works, which actually comes from strategy as to what is the recipe to achieve that story, and that strategy comes from the vision as to what that business aspires to be. And a lot of vast research and some of the research which we are pursuing at the center, where we try to see as to how we actually internalize, the really at the very start of the business, that drive to be a sustainable business, to come up to be an entity that will create a positive environmental and social impact. And the role of leadership is profound in that in infusing that thinking at the very core. So whether it is entrepreneurs, who are starting the business from the very scratch, or the top management boards, the managers, they have profound role in determining, that they have the steering in their hands to be able to drive the business and actually to infuse sustainability in a much more deeper, ingrained, embedded way, rather than having it just as a separate third wheel, which just looks like that it is there but doesn't serve a purpose, and it is considered something insignificant. So some of the research which we are pursuing at the center is where we look at that how it actually imbues from the very beginning in the business, and how it should be internalized in each and every decision making, each and every from top to bottom and bottom to top. Because if that is there in leaders of businesses, then it will find its way. It will filter down to each and every business functions. And sustainable business model. So while the business model, think about how the business will create its story, how it will run, the improvisation of the business model to infuse long-term vision from the very beginning, to infuse as to what are the sustainability challenges we can address, for example, or what are the needs of consumers for a sustainable society we can address, or even what type of products and services which we can create, which will create a positive impact rather than any sort of a negative impact on society. So it can filter down in many ways, but first and foremost, the starting is the ownership and the leadership, which has a very powerful role in determining what path the business takes. And they are also hopefully do not work in silos and listen to external and internal stakeholders who are looking for to be working, to be using products or services that have positive impact. So, for example, on well-being, the lot of research, which also from COVID time, which we have observed, is that how sustainable leadership, had a positive impact through, through the strategies on the employees, which kind of made, for practices that are more equitable at workplaces. And similarly, the products and services, while a sustainable business model that can incorporate long-term value, that can incorporate and engage the expectations of different stakeholders, while that should be something which is kind of take the role of a typical business model. The role of products and services itself is very critical. So, for example, with Industry 4.0, we have seen that there has been so much of technological progress in all these fantastic AI algorithms which are working at the back end of different services or products. But are they creating more inequality in society? Are they creating, sometimes while it looks like that they are environmental friendly, they might actually not be environmental friendly. So it is not just sustainability, not something which one business function can work and just pass it on to another. It requires a much more cumulative and interdisciplinary approach for everybody to come together and say, well, this is what we are creating, and the another arm looks at what impact it will lead on environment and society through that product or service. So I hope that it gave you a kind of overview about why we need sustainable business, and at least some justification of that there is a business case for businesses to be sustainable. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mili. And we mentioned in your introduction that you're from the Centre for Sustainable Business Transformations here at Bournemouth University, which is a brand new centre launched last week. So could you tell us a little bit more about the centre, what you'll be doing and what you're hoping to achieve?
Yes, absolutely, Emma. So Center for Sustainable Business Transformations is a new initiative at BU, as you mentioned. I touched upon it towards the end of my talk that we realized that, first of all, by just telling businesses that you should be sustainable is not enough. We need to work with businesses and come up with strategies which are specific to them, which are specific to their sector, which are specific to their industry, which are specific to their geographical location, and so on, as to what they need to be able to become a sustainable business. So that was one of our drive for setting this center up, where we are, through our research, through our knowledge exchange, we work on projects to look at, what are the needs of businesses to make the transformation towards a sustainable future. Is it the business model? Is it a particular technique? Is it a particular process, structure, and so on? And secondly, sustainability, because it needs to be embedded in the business to its very core, it is a kind of interdisciplinary challenge. So at the center, we have brought together the experts from the business school and our colleagues from Faculty of Science and Technology. So, for example, we work on projects like circular economy. So while at the business school members, we work on how the business models could be circular. Our Faculty of Science and Technology colleagues, they look at, how, for example, digitalization and these innovative techniques can enable businesses to be circular. So together, we kind of bring that well-rounded understanding of how a business could be sustainable or circular. Because we have thought about, by being as business and management experts and science and tech experts, we kind of build together a wide variety of stakeholders to where we have thought about their potential, the potential impact that it will have on them. So the solutions are much more comprehensive and potentially are much more effective, from the policy perspective as well.
Brilliant. And that seems like an opportune moment to bring Rick back in, who is from our Faculty of Science and Technology, for the question and answer session. So thank you to everybody who has submitted questions this evening, and also who's voted on the questions that have come in. I'll start with by far the most popular question, which is from Jenny, who asked, could rising costs and income squeeze have positive effects on consumers by reducing unabated consumption and or lead to expanding things like second-hand and repair and wear markets? I think James has responded in the comments, but Rick, do you have anything to add on that point?
I've seen the question. I've seen James's comments, and I think it's probably right. I mean, to some extent, yes, if there's a financial squeeze, people will be buying less. Some of those things that people will buy will be potentially things which we don't need and which use resources. So there is a potential. There is a potential there. But I think there's two problems to some extent with that, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with having repair markets and reusing and repurposing goods, and it's all stuff that should be absolutely, definitely encouraged. But I don't want to see a position where some people are forced into that sort of situation because they literally can't afford to buy things that they need. And I think that's the issue that we'll have if we could continue with increasing inequality. The other factor is the majority of resource, and this is, I think, what James had put as a comment, and it is completely true. The majority of resource use does come from the people with the most money. And they're not necessarily being hugely affected by the cost of living crisis at the moment. So yes, I think the problem is it's going to force more people into poverty, and it's going to not necessarily affect those people who have the most damaging effects on society. But having said that, yeah, it probably will have some effect, and certainly encouraging things where goods can be reused and not wasted is certainly a good thing.
And Mili, from a business perspective then, how can businesses adapt to that perhaps change in consumer behaviour and people not going out to the shops and not buying as much? What can they do?
Yes, I mean it's I know there's sometimes these triggers. I mean they ironically they kind of drive a particular consumer behavior. Which actually kind of, but still in the long term, it can stabilize over, with the different type of reflections on the business side. And actually it, in a way, it takes for everyone to take a step back. And even the consumerism sometimes, with the kind of so much of products, which don't actually have that wider usage. The businesses also get to think about what is that, which is actually, are we solving the problems of the customers? Are we meeting their needs? So it's, again, I know it's a lot of combination of things which actually can drive the consumer behavior, which actually has happened since pandemic, very stably in one direction or another direction. But I still feel that it gives a moment for reflection for the businesses to kind of think about, again, go back to their value proposition and look at their business model and see what is that story which they are trying to create in the long term.
Great. And we've had another question from Thomas. I think this is probably for you, Rick. Please, can you explain how you factored in the effects of animal agriculture on the environment? So in your models and potential policies, what sort of impact does agriculture and animal farming have?
I'll do my best to answer it. So if you remember, basically the model is a series of, in technical terms, they're nodes, which are kind of names of different things. And I think animal agriculture was one of those nodes. There's then a series of edges which connect up those nodes in various ways. And the model is based around something called a Bayesian belief network. I'm going to try and keep the rest of this as simple as I can, I promise, less technical. Basically, it gives you a probability of one node either increasing or decreasing, given that another node is automatically changing. So if animal agriculture is changing, where does that link, and what sort of effects will it have? So there's a few things which were probably factored in there. One would be around emissions, and there would be a slight positive effect on greenhouse gas emissions as a result of animal agriculture, because we know things like cows and sheep produce considerable amounts of methane, for example, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. There will also be things around land use. So again, animal agriculture uses up significant amounts of land. More animal agriculture will use more land, which could go to other purposes. So potentially that link into things like land use change as well. It's never a hard and fast argument, but I think the majority of animal agriculture probably had some negative effects on the environment. That isn't always the case, I know, but generally at very low levels, we're probably not really talking about animal agriculture. We're probably talking more about managed grazing with potential offshoots for some of those animals. So I think that's really how it worked. I can't remember the exact details. I imagine both of those things were in there, but I can't remember off the top of my head all the other details, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Rick. And we've had a couple of questions on kind of similar points from JW and Mariola, saying it's a really interesting talk, but you're probably preaching to the converted this evening. People are already interested in being more sustainable. So how can we educate people like decision makers, politicians, that wealthy 1% who are still buying Moet champagne? How can we make sure that they're also contributing to a more sustainable future? Mili, if we come to you first, perhaps.
Well, it's I think to have that the vision for I mean the sustainability is about that there will be enough for everyone forever. And actually, as I was saying, whether in terms of business or whether in terms of for as a person, it depends. It starts from the very realization of looking at the external environment, the changes which we have had, especially in last couple of years. It should like trigger that consciousness, and so that will be that's a starting point. But of course, in terms of in terms of literally contributing to the society and in not harming a planet and people in any way possible, and not just harming but creating a positive impact, that awakening has to be really come from an individual perspective, to a community and then at the larger level. So it's a business case for everyone, whether it is a business, whether it is a human being at the personal level, or even for governments, because as we have seen that there is everybody kind of there was a kind of steep learning in the impact which we are potentially creating, which we have created on society and planet, in our existence. So hopefully that awakening will come, and hopefully that's fingers crossed.
And Rick?
We're in an interesting position. Interested may be the right word, but we're in an interesting position, I guess, at the moment. And going back to the start of my talk, from talking about doing a talk like this in 2019, we were probably at peak sort of awareness of the environment. But we're also maybe at that saturation point as well. So actually, we can put out these ideas, and some people will be interested, and you really were probably preaching to the converted. I appreciate the comments, and I think that's probably also very true tonight. But we are in an interesting situation where standards of living are about to decrease quite considerably in the UK, and probably around most of the world as well. And what we need to be doing at the moment is to make a case for alternative models, sustainable models, to be an alternative to what's being done at the moment. And at the moment, that's not something that we see. But if we can get that out, that will get picked up by political parties. Because it will get picked up by the public who really want some change and really have other drivers, not just environmental drivers, for those changes. So I think that's going to be one of the real key things. And if we can get the politics side of that sorted, then there's things like how do you get wealthy people to contribute. My answer to that is you tax them, basically. So I think that's probably achievable once the public are on side, and once the public have convinced the government that we need alternative processes. And maybe that is the time to be doing that right now. I think also, though, we've got potential to move away from solely government strategies. If we can create businesses which are working on new models and working successfully on those new models and doing their bit as well. So, really not just in terms of things like reducing carbon emissions, but also, increasing, treating their staff well, making sure that the gap between the richest and the poorest paid in the companies aren't huge. I think that will help facilitate that change as well. It is difficult. It is an uphill struggle. And I think, but potentially there is something which could happen over the next few years, which could really facilitate those changes.
And do you think that is what will make that change? It's kind of people power, people refusing to shop at businesses that aren't sustainable and not voting for parties that aren't putting forward sustainable options? Or do you think there's kind of other external factors as well?
Personally, I don't think I mean, people power and purchase power are important. There's no doubt about it. I think what will make the change is people will see their standards of living falling and they want solutions for that. So it's about being able to provide solutions for that, which also benefit the environment as well. The environment is a concern for people. We know it's a concern for lots of people, but there may be bigger concerns at the moment. We need to be able to address all of those problems at once, and there are ways of doing that.
And just following on from that, actually, David has asked, do you think convenience made a big impact in terms of poor sustainable purchases, and I suppose also price at the moment as well? Is that driving consumer behaviour more so than thinking about the impact it might have on the environment or the planet? Mili, perhaps if we come to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely. I mean, so the power of purchasing, as Rick was saying, that it has an impact on the business actions, and of course the cost of living crisis. At any such situation, the immediate solution will be to go for products that are not to do that trade-off between the whether if it is something which is having a bit of price premium for being a better product in terms of its environmental impact, or even in terms of social impact. So when we look at in the food choices, so how, for example, there could be trade-off between potentially going for something which is more healthy, trading off with something which is more convenient, potentially cheaper. So that these things, they actually kind of look like that they will be a factor of trading off between the sustainable and not so sustainable choice. But from the business perspective, though it might look like in the short term, I mean, of course, from the people perspective, there might be, but if we think about the long term impact, anybody who's thinking about the long term, will, of course, we are aware that there will be some sort of, of course, people are trading off with, there are serious decisions to be made with the cost of living crisis. But from the business perspective, what we have seen in last few years is just so opposed to anything with short term. So for businesses to be able to be, and it is not just about, coming with a product which is potentially, a bit less, with less costlier for the consumers, in the cost of living crisis and so on. But for example, if you think about a business that is producing plastic spoons, do they think that they will be viable are they viable now, or would they be viable in next 6 months or next 1 year? So if they ask these questions to themselves, that's slowly the market is still growing and whether if people make these trade-offs between the sustainable product and non-sustainable product in the short term, even in the long term, because the consciousness has been on rise, the consumer behavior is telling, and vast research and ONS studies have been telling that, well, there is a significant change in consumer behavior with what we have seen, from the pandemic. In the long term, still there will be questions about, whether the impact of any product in terms of environment or the well-being. So in the long term, from a business perspective, though it might look like something which is counterintuitive, something which is one needs to be trading off for short-term success, in the long term, not if you think about like the multi-stakeholder engagement, so it is not just about thinking about a particular stakeholder. There are various types of stakeholders associated with businesses. So in the long term, it will be needed on the part of businesses to be employing practices which are sustainable, to be coming up with products that are not just environmentally friendly, but also, for example, work for the people, work for the well-being of people. So things like that. Even I know that there will be these challenges in the short term, but from business perspective, it's a business case for them to be sustainable in the long term, to be able to run, like having an MOT.
And Rick, anything to add to that?
No, I think I agree. I think it's probably true. Convenience has led to some poor products. The plastic spoon example may well be a good example of that. I think the other thing that convenience has led to is also just more use of resources. So people are just purchasing more because it's convenient to do so, and that's the other problem. So yeah, I would agree with the statement there from the question there from David. I think it probably has had implications, definitely.
And the question we posed at the start of this event was whether economic prosperity can kind of be balanced with the need to protect our planet and also our people, I think has come out strongly from tonight's talks as well. So what one thing would you like to see happen that could perhaps make that a reality? Rick, if we start with you.
I think we need to break down the economic paradigm around economic growth. There's economic growth, which is fundamentally bad. There can be economic growth which is fundamentally good. They're not necessarily the same thing. I think there's places like I think it's Sweden who've actually looked at moving towards a happiness index for people. Whether or not they're still there, I don't know, but they did a few years ago begin to move towards that sort of process. And I think clearly there are places where we need to grow the economy. If we're going to make renewable energy, for example, we need to grow the economy in those sectors. But there's clearly other areas where we need to shrink it. And just saying we need to grow the economy isn't helpful. We also need, and I think it is economic prosperity, to have an equal society. I think having a very unequal society doesn't have to be 100% equal. I have previously been called a Marxist sandal muncher on Twitter, which I think is my favorite insult I've ever had. But I'm not trying to say that even. Just need to make a much more equal society than what we've got now. And I think that is part of economic prosperity.
And Mili, how about you?
Well, absolutely. I believe that with sustainability is essential for economic prosperity, because if we have a society which is thriving, which is in where the interest and benefits for every stakeholder has been thought about, that will actually play a role in creating that economic prosperity. And even from the business perspective, what we have seen in last few years, a vast evidence, which some of which we highlighted, actually suggests that to be able to be viable, like Rick mentioned about the use of, I have been in some of the policy briefing sessions, we have literally heard businesses that they are not able to run their manufacturing unit in a particular location because of the lack of natural resources. And they are trying to think about their manufacturing unit to another location. But is it that they can get away with using the resource at one place and just move the manufacturing unit to another place? That was 5 years back, and with the kind of as I said, the consciousness, the awakening, and we have the channels through which it's not any hidden. It is not just that a business has a sustainability report and everybody reads it and gets convinced that this is what they are doing, and they actually question. So to be able to be economic prosperous, sustainability is something, because they have to move hand in hand with planet and people who are thriving, and planet which is still able to at least give them, even for some businesses who need some natural resources for manufacturing their products or services. And society is a big giver in terms of human capital and other resources. So the businesses have to play for them. It's way past that they could have done just something and just focus on creating the value for shareholders. It is now they have to to be addressing the needs of every stakeholder, to be able to just be functioning, to have the reputation.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. I think I'm going to draw the event to a close now, as we've got through all the questions that have been asked. But thanks again to Rick and to Mili for joining us this evening and for sharing their research. We will be sending out an email after tonight's event that will share some of the research and resources that were mentioned in tonight's talks. So do keep an eye out for that. And there'll also be a feedback survey that would be part of that. So let us know how you found tonight's event, and if there's anything we can do to improve it, as we want to make sure we're putting on the best events possible. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. If you did enjoy tonight's event and you want to come along to more events in this series, we've got a whole range of events taking place over the coming months. Our next event will be on Tuesday, the 24th of January, with our Orthopaedic Research Institute, who will be talking about improving recovery after surgery. So if you click on the green button that's at the bottom of your screen now, or visit the Bournemouth University website, you can find out more about that and other upcoming events from Bournemouth University. We're going to close this event now, but please do use this time to pop any final comments or reflections in the chat based on what you've heard this evening. And if you want to come back and rewatch or revisit tonight's event, then you can use the same web link that you used to join us to watch the recording as well. So once again, thank you very much all of you for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.
Thank you.
At Bournemouth University, we have the power to change the world. Through the learning we inspire.
I am studying Business Information Technology.
Midwifery, television production.
The advances in new knowledge we make.
My research is
the design and development of prosthetic limbs used by high-level athletes.
And how we're using those discoveries in practice.
With my degree, I want to support women in the most vulnerable and beautiful moment of their life.
At Bournemouth University, we believe that to learn is to change.
That's our motto.
That's our story.
That's our power.
Let's change the world
together.